So I want to talk through a little bit about geography and how geography shapes foreign policy and global affairs. And this is sort of ties into something we've been talking about with Goldstein and Peephouse, sort of levels of analysis, where they sort of separate theories into sort of global or structural theories, interstate theories, and then state and individual level factors, which we'll talk about later. But today I want to kind of dig into this idea of geography and how geography affects the economic prosperity of states, their military strategies and concerns, and also then maybe tie it back into some of the big trends we've seen in history that really have a root deep in geography. So I'll begin just with the observation that in order to trade with somebody, you need to be able to be geographically proximate, right? So if you're close by, you can trade with somebody because you can give them the good in exchange for money. Historically, that was really a big limiter on trade, that you could maybe go to the next town over, but more than about 20 miles and, a horse-drawn cart really wasn't a very efficient way of moving goods or services. And so trade was very localized. The exception would be, of course, as it is kind of today, that if you have access to waterways, right, rivers and oceans, shipping becomes cheaper and far more feasible. That you can move large quantities of goods longer distances and do so in a way that actually can be managed if you have access to the water. And that means that countries that do have access to the water are in a very economically favorable position because they're able to trade. Whereas countries in blue here on the map are landlocked and really are limited in their ability to engage in trade, especially poor Uzbekistan, which is doubly landlocked. It's completely surrounded by other landlocked countries. And these countries tend to struggle economically because they tend to have a hard time participating in global trade and being efficient and competitive in global trade because you have that extra transportation cost that goes in. Yet even today, we do see geography playing a really important role in trade patterns. The United States' primary trade partners are Mexico and Canada, in part because of geographic proximity of Mexico and Canada to the United States. Okay, so trade is definitely related to geography, but so is military force. And so we can think about this in a variety of ways. We can just think about it as just the logistics of projecting force across large distances is difficult. Most countries don't have the ability to project force much beyond their own borders. Some countries do, but it requires equipment and training and logistics and all sorts of planning to be able to make that possible. Only a handful of countries are able to project force at great distances. Sometimes we call those great powers. And typically when we're thinking about a superpower, we're talking about a country that's able to project force globally to reach all different regions and parts of the world militarily. I will add in that projecting force, sending troops or blowing stuff up, is really hard to do in mountainous terrain. Mountains are really difficult to control, so much so that just having mountains in your country is a risk factor for civil war. It's one of the biggest risk factors for civil war because it's just so physically hard to control the geography of mountains. But then there's sort of one other observation I'll make, and this one's going to end up being really important for the conversation here, and that is that fundamentally different types of militaries are needed to project force across land and across water. This is sometimes called the stopping power of water. And what it essentially means is that when a land army reaches the shore, it has to stop. It has to retool. It needs ships if it's going to advance much further. And so I'll even sort of jump back here and highlight that Britain was not concerned particularly at the start of the 20th century by Germany's unification and the fact that Germany had become militarily the dominant country within Europe, in part because Germany was a land-based power. It was building up its army. It wasn't until Germany started building up a navy that Britain sort of perked up and said, wait a second, this is potentially a security threat for us because there is, as John Mearsheimer has labeled, this stopping power of water. It's actually a really powerful force in part because it's not just can you get your army onto ships, it's can you get them back onto land. And amphibious assaults are very, very difficult operations to carry out successfully. It's not a desirable military position to be in to attempt an amphibious landing on a large scale. So water is going to shape things a great deal, and that sort of sets the stage for this conversation I'd like to have. And I should flag that this isn't my sort of insight into international relations and geography. It comes from a guy named Macandrew, who I believe was the president of the American Geographic Society. And I think in 1901, he was giving a speech to the society in which he said, okay, let's step back and let's think about the Earth in just very abstract terms, like what the heck is it? What's going on? And he says, so there's this, most of the land on Earth is in the Eastern Hemisphere. And most of that land is sort of centered in the sort of big Eurasian landmass, which has sort of Central Asia, this massive open grassland space. And then there's Europe, which is sort of this fertile peninsula that's kind of tacked on to the west of the grasslands. And then there's the Middle East, which is kind of an arid region, lower population. You've got India, fertile peninsula, but it's cut off by mountains from Central Asia. And you've got China, which is also this sort of fertile region that's kind of on the eastern side of the Central Asia, but it's cut off by mountains and by desert and I guess by some walls. So it's kind of isolated as well. You've got the Americas, which are in the Western Hemisphere, but they have a much smaller share of the Earth's land. You have sub-Saharan Africa, which is kind of separated from the rest of Eurasia by the Sahara Desert, which is functionally a barrier that's almost impossible to cross in any large numbers, particularly historically before planes or rail lines. So sub-Saharan Africa is essentially cut off from the rest of Eurasia, and so is Australia, cut off largely from the rest of Eurasia. Now there are trade networks that kind of link all this together, but they're relatively minor, particularly historically when transportation options were relatively limited. And if you're having kind of a hard time picturing sort of what Macandrew was seeing, I think this image, which you may have seen before, kind of helps capture the basic idea, right? So you see this sort of fertile peninsula that is Western Europe, or I guess all of Europe. You can kind of see that the Middle East is slightly less populated, but you can kind of see the outlines of it. You can see how India is kind of cut off from the rest of Asia by mountains, and how the Himalayan plateau kind of extends in and wraps up around China and kind of isolates it from the rest of Asia. And then you see, sub-Saharan Africa, which is kind of cut off from the rest of the region by the Sahara Desert, that kind of, largely empty space that cuts sort of through the middle of North Africa. And so this is sort of how Macandrew was thinking about the world. And as he was thinking about that, he came to realize that the only region in the world that historically had the ability to interact with other regions was this Central Asia grasslands. And he calls this the pivot area, just kind of the pivot point on which all of history is turning. All these other regions are sort of around it. And he notes that the pivot can access China, and it can access India, and it can access the Middle East and Western Europe, which allows for it to potentially dominate, potentially extract resources from, potentially influence all of these different regions in a way that no other region really has an ability to do. And I want to kind of extend that idea out just a little bit, and note that when states are thinking about getting access to resources, there's really two strategies that they can take, right? So one of those is to try to extract more resources internally from your own territory. And so maybe you can do that if you have railroads, which allow for you to sort of reach deeper into your territory and pull out agricultural goods or minerals that previously would have been prohibitively difficult to transport. River systems also can do that. And so building up canal system so that your rivers, or dredging your rivers so that they're navigable, can help increase your ability to extract resources. We could think about irrigation and desalination similarly as ways to kind of take the resource base that you have and make it more productive, prosperous, useful. So there's the internal approach. Or you can seek to secure access to resources from outside. Historically, this was done through colonialism. That was one of the primary drivers of colonialism, was there are resources out there in the world. I would really like to control those resources. And so I'm going to set up economic relationships and colonial ties that give me access to those resources. Today, we tend to instead negotiate trade agreements to ensure that we have access to resources. To facilitate that, so trade ends up being a really important part of this story. And the story, as Nicander tells it, is that historically, Central Asia was in a position to dominate the whole of Eurasia, that it was geographically in a position to reach those regions, something that no one else could do. But also, like, as a weird quirk of sort of technology, in the technology of warfare, ended up being really militarily powerful because the primary military power for most of human history was horses, was access to horses, which allowed for you to be highly mobile. And vast open grasslands end up being the perfect place for the assembling of large armies of nomadic people who can roll across the plains of Central Asia, gathering numbers, and strike into Western Europe or the Middle East or India or into China. And they're able to extract resources in the form of tribute from all of those other regions of the world. And so Nicander would say that the Mongol Empire, the largest, the greatest land-based empire in human history, was facilitated by that combination of geography, having access to all these regions, and having that sort of fortuitous pairing of geography and technology in the form of horses that allowed for the Mongol Empire to strike into all 4 of the proximate regions around Central Asia, which is kind of an interesting way to think about that dynamic. But that dynamic gets upended in about 1500 with the rise of transportation systems. And so again, we're seeing an interaction between the physical geography and the technology that exists to facilitate movement. And then in 1500, Europeans began to navigate the earth using ocean vessels, ships, and do that in large enough numbers and in a great enough scale that it really changes the overall balance. That suddenly countries in Europe are able to reach those other regions, such as India, such as China, but in addition are able to get access to the Western Hemisphere, and suddenly they're able to pull resources in a way that they never could have done before, and in a way that the pivot actually can't do. And so this is a map I just kind of pulled off that kind of illustrates this process. This is shipping lanes for Britain in 1750 to 1800. And you can kind of see this process of Britain is pulling resources out from all across the planet, from all these different regions, and it's bringing them back to Britain. It's processing them as manufactured goods and it's shipping them back out. And that fuels this incredible economic military machine that facilitates the British Empire for hundreds of years. It's that access to those other regions and the resources that they have that makes that possible. And so Nicander's sort of playing this out, and then he sort of speculates and says, well, you know, that relationship that has made Western Europe economically dominant relative to other regions and relative to the pivot, that shift of sort of the global center of power to Europe may be reversing. And he highlights that the Trans-Siberian Railroad is finishing up or just finished, and kind of speculates that, well, that the railroads will allow for the extraction of resources from the hinterlands of Russia in a way that had never been possible before. And so actually, if we kind of go back to this sort of map of you know, I'm not saying the map, it's a photo of the Earth at night, we can actually see that exact thing. If you look at Russia, you can follow this line across the heart of Russia, the Trans-Siberian Railroad, and all the spurs that go off of it. And that's essentially this great big collector that's collecting resources, minerals, and agricultural goods from all across Russia and routing them westward toward Moscow. Right? It's allowing for Russia to extract resources on a scale that previously would have been impossible. And so that suggests in Mackinder's mind that we may see a rebalancing of the world back from Western Europe more to the pivot again. And I think because Mackinder's sort of speculating about this in 1900, I think it's worth highlighting that that's not a bad way to tell the story of the 20th century. That over the course of the 20th century, you see the rise of Russia as an industrial power in the form of the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union expands into Europe, into the eastern part. It is pushing into the Middle East. After World War II, the United States and the Soviet Union clash over Iran and elsewhere. It is able to form an alliance sort of with India, although I wouldn't say that it pushed in militarily, although Afghanistan potentially. And then had this partnership with India where with China. It started the Cold War. And so you can maybe see that picture of the Soviet Union sort of influencing all these different regions. And it also kind of keys in on something else that Mackinder was noting, and that was the inner crescent. Those countries that are bordering along the pivot are going to feel pressure from the pivot. But there's also this outer crescent. These are countries that are not connected by land to the pivot, but have a concern that maybe if the pivot becomes too strong, that will be dangerous, and will work to try to prevent the pivot from taking over all of these different regions. And so we might anticipate from Mackinder's perspective, the countries in the outer insular crescent, like the United States, like Britain, Japan, Australia, might form an alliance and work together as a alliance bloc to counter the pivot. And if we sort of think about the Cold War and that history, that's kind of the US alliance system right there. So Mackinder started foreseeing this, this sort of shift of power back to the pivot to Russia, essentially, and anticipating that that's going to set off a global sort of balance of power. I'm going to highlight that we're actually seeing a second or a third or fourth shift in these kind of regions and how they interact. And so I'll try to illustrate that with trade ties. And this is data on from the International Monetary Fund, connecting countries with their primary trade partner in terms of imports plus exports. And so it's not all trading relationships, it's just trading relationships with your primary trade partner. And so in 1960, the global trading network looks kind of centered on Europe, with Germany and France tied together, along with a bunch of other European countries. You have the United States and a lot of countries in sort of the Western Hemisphere, and you have Britain with countries that are sort of proximate, as well as sort of the British Empire. And the Soviet Union kind of has its own little network. It's kind of much smaller and kind of off on its own and not really connected to anything else. In the 1970s, things look pretty much the same, except Japan is now part of that network and has a number of countries that it's sort of building strong trade ties with. In the 1980s, things start shifting a little bit. The UK has migrated closer to that European network. The US network is a little bit smaller and kind of tied in with Japan a little bit. In the 1990s, things look, again, a little bit different, where that European network seems to be getting a little denser, which would suggest the European Union kind of tying in here. There's now a China network that's existing. It's kind of built up some of the legacy of the former Soviet Union, which is kind of disappearing at this point in that conversation. It's limited ties because it collapses in the early 1990s. But over the course of the 1990s, China negotiates a entry into the World Trade Organization. And so we see that in the early 2000s, that China starts tying in a little bit more closely to the global economy. The European Union is still really tightly integrated, but Japan and China and the United States and Australia are kind of forming this network. In 2010, Japan has really supplanted, I'm sorry, China has supplanted Japan as sort of the core of that Pacific network between the United States and China. Um, and in 2020, I would say China has really become the core of that network, very much um, with with sort of secondary networks extending out from relationships with Japan or with China. And so this is actually a really interesting story about the shift in the global economy. That what we're seeing is that for 500 years, the sort of core of global trading was taking place within Europe as that sort of region that was able to initially um, rise and develop compared to the pivot by fostering trade and economic ties with the rest of the world, that China has essentially replicated that process. And we can think about major Chinese initiatives like the One Belt and One Road initiative, which was about building up physical infrastructure to facilitate trade, ports and roads and pipelines and all that sort of stuff, all across Asia and into Africa and up into Europe even, as essentially trying to create the infrastructure to facilitate trade relationships around China to allow for access to resources, to allow for access to markets. And so I think we're really at sort of this moment where we're seeing this shift in the global system away from that sort of Western Europe pivot sort of dynamic to a situation where China is the center of the new sort of global economy and is relatively stronger than the pivot for the first time in a very, very long time in human history.